Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. As always, my name is Thomas and our very special guest has returned back to the channel. Paul, the Esk, joins me to talk about everything that's going on at Everton at the moment. There's been plenty of, investment news. We're going to have to talk about the transfer window as well. And we just kind of want to figure out where we are as a club, not going into the season. The season has started, but still going into the rest of the season, into the next year and beyond. Paul, thank you very much for coming on. How are you doing?
A lot better than I was, thanks, Thomas. I think most people who listen to podcasts have probably heard what's happened to me, but nearly a month on now, I'm feeling a lot stronger and getting back there. Still have a few problems with my short-term memory, so if I forget anybody's name, you're just going to have to sort of live with it.
Yeah,
But it's a
I
lot
don't know
better.
anyone's name either.
It's a lot better than it was a couple of weeks ago when, frankly, I just could not remember a thing. I was driving my family mad because I kept on asking them the same questions all the time.
Oh well, then.
Anyway,
Well, glad to see you making a recovery. Unfortunately, not particularly positive news to get into, but we do have to get into it nonetheless. We may as well start off. Oh, what is it? A month ago now? A couple of months ago? Must be about a month ago. Where the MSP deal clearly fell through. I think it was the Athletic article that came out first. I think probably the last time that we spoke, Paul, we were talking about, the MSP investment is imminent. We were all pretty
yeah,
convinced it was going to happen. It was absolutely, well, it still is necessary, but it was absolutely necessary at the time. Obviously, now where we stand in, September started, hasn't it? MSP have not made their investment. They've seemingly withdrawn. I'm not sure if that's the full picture, but tell us, Paul, sorry, tell us a story from, we were pretty adamant that it was going to happen. The investment seemed imminent to now where it seemingly is gone away completely.
yeah. Well, I mean, MSP notified the New York Stock Exchange that they'd raised $165 million, which is about 130 million pound, specifically to invest in Everton. They didn't give any details as to how it was going to be invested, but that they had raised money from 13 of their clients, and the money was there to be invested. So uh, I think you know I don't think it was unreasonable for everybody to expect that the investment would have taken place by now. And the idea was very much one of two things: one, to provide some funding for the stadium, which we'll talk about in a second, and secondly, to provide some very necessary cash for the business itself, for the football club. And in return for those two investments, they'd get a rate of return, get interest paid on the stadium loan, and they would get an up to sort of a 25% stake in the club for perhaps maybe 35 million that they might put into the club to help the club's what's called working capital requirements. Now, as it transpires, they didn't put the money into the club, so the equity side of the deal failed. And there's two different theories as to why it failed. One is that Rights and Media Funding, which is the company that Everton owe nearly £200 million to, said no to the deal at the last moment, and they have the right to say no to any investment or any new cash that comes into the club, because they effectively hold all of the security around the club. So they've effectively got financial control of Everton Football Club, at least in terms of new investment or in terms of new debt. I think the story's slightly different, because what happened was, if MSP had put the money into the, we'll talk about the stadium in a second, but if they put the money into the football club, Rights and Media Funding, the people that we've borrowed 200 million from, wanted us to reduce the amount that we've borrowed from them. So effectively, the money that was going to go into the football club from MSP would have flowed straight through, or most of it would have flowed straight through to Rights and Media Funding, because they would have wanted their loan to be reduced in size. So then we'd have a situation whereby Farhad Moshiri is given up to, say, 25% of the club away, but there's been no cash benefit to the club. Okay, the debt has. So we're left with a situation whereby Moshiri probably reckoned that because the money that was coming into the football club was going straight through to rights and media funding, there was no real benefit to the football club. That the debt would have reduced, which is useful, and therefore the interest payments would have reduced. But actually, the biggest concern, and again, we're going to talk about this when we talk about the transfer window, the biggest concern the club has got at the moment is how much cash it's got. And the cash that we would have got from rights and media funding was critical. So when it became known that rights and media funding wanted the debt to be reduced or part of it paid down, I think Moshiri reckoned that there was no great benefit to doing that, particularly when we were giving up to sort of 25% of the club away. So that part of the deal definitely didn't happen. MSP were very keen to tell everybody that they were still going to lend Everton 100 million and lend the Stadium Development Company 100 million pound. And nobody has said that that's not going to happen. But there's also no evidence yet that it has happened. And one would have thought, had it happened, and we're talking now about what, 3 or 4 weeks, had it happened, MSP would have said something about it, and certainly Everton Football Club would have said something about it. So there's a reason and an unknown reason as to why it's not happened. It's not because MSP don't have the money, because we know that they've got the money, and the money is sitting in a designated account to come over. There is another reason, and I have to admit, I don't know what that reason is. The Stadium Development Company took some of the money that Andy Bell and George Downing put into the football club in May. And as a result, Andy Bell's company holds a charge against the Stadium Development Company. So had the money from MSP gone into the Stadium Development Company, the charge would have changed. It would have changed in favor, no longer in favor of Andy Bell's company, but in favor of MSP. And that hasn't happened. So we know that the money has not yet gone over to the Stadium Development Company. So the football club is in exactly the same position as it was several months ago, in the sense that it still doesn't have any money as working capital, but it doesn't have any money, new money, to continue to fund the stadium, i.e. pay Langer O'Rourke. And that's obviously a big concern, because we know that Farhad Moshiri is not willing to put any more money into the club, or able to put any more money into the club. And we also know that we've got to the limit of the amount of debt that the club can take. Now, the club is currently spending every single penny it earns from Sky, other broadcasters, gate money, season tickets, etc., and all of the commercial revenue that comes in. We're currently spending all of that money just on our operating costs and our player wages. So it's not as if we have spare cash that we can use to pay for the stadium. And this is a big problem going forward, unless we resolve the issue of MSP putting money into the Stadium Development Company, or somebody else coming along and putting money into the Stadium Development Company. The club's got a big issue going forwards. And I think that's reflected in what happened in the transfer window, when we spent the minimum amount that we possibly could, and we deferred payment for the players that we bought. I think we spent €3 million. Paddy Boyland from the Athletic quoted that figure. And obviously we generated a fair amount of cash in terms of player sales, and we've reduced our wage bill, so our future costs are going to be lower than they were before the end of the window. But I think that's purely a reflection of the club's financial position. It's not necessarily, I think, what Sean Dyche will have wanted, and it's not what our director of football would have wanted neither. It does put us in a difficult position. I think we can comfortably argue that whilst it's great to have a goal scorer, in terms of Beto up front and a couple of the other acquisitions that we've made, some of them loans, the squad overall is in a weaker position than it was going into the window. The squad is in a weaker position coming out of the window compared to what it was going into the window.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that a lot of people will wonder. You touched on towards the end there about the fact that we brought in plenty of money. We saw that, I mean, there was the sales of Alex Iwobi and Damari Gray, a couple of the youth players as well, Cannon and Sims, and then people will obviously ask questions as to why we're not spending that money. People will ask questions back to January why the Gordon money wasn't spent, and people are putting that down to, well, FFP, it's profitability and sustainability. Bit of a mouthful, that one, but the problem almost seems twofold. I think, is it that the club need to kind of demonstrate, well, they're on their best behaviour. We know that this investigation is going on, despite the fact that it's now been reported that there'll be no sporting sanctions, which I'm sure everyone breathed a slight sigh of relief. But as I said, it's almost twofold. I mean, the club almost now have to demonstrate that they can operate more, financially stable, but also the fact that the money that we're bringing in from transfers isn't necessarily going back into the transfer budget because of the lack of working capital at the club and the fact that we're basically just strapped for cash at this point in time.
Yeah, and what spare cash we have from transfers, effectively we're having to reserve at this moment in time for future stadium payments. So if the money now comes through from MSP or indeed anybody else, obviously that money is going to be paid on the stadium, but we won't be able to obviously do any more transfer business until the January transfer window. So we're in a position that was forced upon us by the virtue of the fact that we didn't get the investment money in that we thought we were going to get earlier in the summer. Just pick you up on one point, and I've seen a lot of people say this: the news that's coming out about sporting sanctions. Whilst that news is probably welcome for the future, it's not actually going to affect what's happening presently, because we have to wait for the legislation to go through. We have to wait for the independent regulator to be formed before those new regulations or those new conditions come through. So, that's still quite some time off. I would imagine that's probably at least 12 months off. Now, whatever is determined in the next few weeks from the independent commission, that's going to be determined now. It's going to be determined before those new conditions come in. So if we have a problem in the future in terms of profitability and sustainability, then this change of regulation may assist us, but it's not going to assist us necessarily if we were to be found guilty by the independent commission when they reach a decision. I think most people are saying in October. Now, obviously, we all hope that the decision that they reach is that we don't have a case to answer for. But if we do have a case to answer for, what's come out in the news this week won't apply to that, because the independent regulator won't be in position. The legislation won't be in position when the independent commission reaches its findings.
Well, thank you for correcting me on that. It makes me slightly more uncomfortable, though, because that sigh of relief that I was breathing has now gone out the window. But hopefully the club are obviously found that there is no wrongdoing currently. But I mean, in terms of wrongdoing going forwards, we've mentioned that MSP, there's allegedly this loan that's up in the air currently. We don't really know what the situation is with that, and I will want to get back to the transfer window. But before we get there, I think it is worth mentioning 777 or 777 that the club have been widely linked with for quite a few months now. Recently, Josh Wander, who I'm not exactly sure what his position is, that he's been elected to the board of the ECA. But there has been plenty of news about their unsuitability to run football clubs, and I think it's the Josimar article. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I do apologise. I think they've really been leading the way and demonstrating their unsuitability, and there is a lot of talk about people want Moshiri out. in any capacity. People just want him gone. But that's not necessarily a good thing if 777 were to purchase a majority stake in the club. Do you want to just talk us a bit through that and why they are completely unsuitable, and why it's not necessarily the fact that Moshiri gone and them coming in would necessarily solve any issues?
Sure. I mean, many people will be aware of the journalist Paul Brown. He's done a lot of work on 777. Not only with regards to football, but also with regards to basketball, which is one of the sports that he particularly enjoys himself. And unfortunately, if you look at sevens, or let's call it 777, sorry, if you look at 777, it's not only sports that they invest in other businesses as well, and pretty much they're pretty consistent across the board in terms of the businesses that they invest in. Most of those businesses, as a result of 777's investment, can be characterized by one thing, and that is that they almost always end up being short of cash. So the track record of 777 in terms of managing all sorts of different types of businesses, aviation businesses, insurance businesses, some software services businesses, as well as football businesses, the overriding characteristic is that they end up being short of cash, and they don't necessarily get the investment that 777 promised at the point where they entered into a particular company. So if you look across their investments in European football, there are several clubs. The fans of several clubs are complaining that the monies that were promised at the time where they invested haven't flowed through, and as a result, those teams haven't been able to make the investments in their squad that effectively 777 promised. And that is obviously a big concern for Everton, given the state of our finances and the fact that, without somebody investing quite significant sums of money, not only in the stadium, but actually in the football club itself, we're going to find it very difficult to remain competitive in the Premier League. The squad is already down to its bare bones, and even more so after this last transfer window. To have an investor come in that promises money, and then that money, for whatever reason, isn't delivered, and to have investors come in that don't necessarily have a great track record, as much as they talk about improving, the commercial arrangements of the clubs that they invest in, there's no great evidence of that. In fact, there's no evidence at all of that. So it's very difficult to accept at face value what 777 are promising. Now, if we as fans can see that, the big question is, why can't Farhad Moshiri? And what is it about 777 that Farhad Moshiri finds so attractive as an investment proposition? Because 777 aren't. It's not as if they're buying the whole club of Farhad Moshiri. Farhad Moshiri is going to remain a shareholder even after 777's investment, should that happen. And surely it's in his interests, as much as it's in our interests, to have an investor that comes in that can provide management expertise, which, as I say, I don't think 777 can, but also provide the money that Farhad Moshiri no longer can provide. Because let's not beat around the bush. The club is desperately short of money. It's short of money on the footballing side because we spend every penny that we earn, and it's obviously going to be short of money on the stadium side because we haven't yet got the investment from MSP or anywhere else that we desperately need. So it's 777 coming into the business. It is something that concerns me greatly, and it's something that I think more and more Evertonians need to be aware of. And yes, we do want Farhad Moshiri to move on. In an ideal world, he would sell his complete shareholding and have nothing to do with the club. But even in a less than ideal world, if his shareholding is reduced by somebody coming in and buying a stake in the club, I'd want to see his influence minimized, because it's very clear that he doesn't know how to run a football club, and the decisions that he's made over the 7 years that he's been at Everton have been to the club's detriment. And our financial performance year on year has been poor, and we are now in this horrible position where we're not competitive in the Premier League. We don't have the resources to change that, and we don't have the people in the business to make the changes in terms of how the business is run, to see any improvement in the future. Now, all of that sounds horribly negative, and I'm reluctant to apologize for it, because I think it's actually the truth. And I think if we know the truth, then I think that's then when we can start doing something about it. I think it's clear to me that we have to put as much pressure as we possibly can as a fan base on Farhad Moshiri to make the right decisions, and not necessarily the decisions that are right for him in the short term. One of the issues that we have is that he is trying to sell the club or sell an equity stake in the club for the maximum amount that he possibly can, so that he can recover, much of the investment that he's made. The one thing we can't criticize him for is the fact that he put £750 million into the club, and he paid the existing shareholders £130 million for their shares. So he's invested nearly £900 million into the football club. He's not ever going to even get half of that back if he sells now. In fact, he's going to get significantly less than half of that back if he sells now. But if this football club is to survive, if Farhad Moshiri is to get any return on his investment, either now or by holding a stake, which hopefully increases in value over the long term, he has to sell to the right investors. He has to sell to investors that not only have got the cash and the resources to recapitalize Everton and to pay for the stadium and everything else that needs doing, but people who actually know what they're doing, people who are experts in growing the revenue side of the business, but also people who are experts in actually running a professional sports operation. And that's what we've got to call for. That's what we've got to put pressure on Farhad Moshiri and every other stakeholder surrounding Everton. The commercial arrangements that we have, the sponsors that we have, the city council, in terms of the impact that potentially not having Bramley more built or funded, what impact does that have on the development potential for the north of Liverpool? We've got to put much more pressure on as many people as possible to assist us in finding the right investors, and finding investors, as I say, that can not only put the money into the club, but actually can provide the management solutions that the club is desperately crying out for.
Yeah, and I think the two main words there really are credibility and experience. We don't just want anyone to come in and take on the club, especially not 777 Partners. And if you haven't read the articles that by Paul Brown and the other one that I mentioned, if you haven't read them so far, you absolutely have to. If you think for any reason that their investment would be a good idea. But back to the credibility and the experience, people will probably ask the question then, why is it that the club are seemingly struggling to find a suitor when people look at the rest of the Premier League, look at the purchase of Chelsea, look at the purchase of Newcastle in the past couple of years? Is that why is it that Everton Football Club are in this position where we seemingly can't find a credible suitor that would suit the club? Is that about how much they'd have to invest in the club? Is that how basically, how much money they'd have to pay on day dot before they even get into the rest of the finances or the club? Or is there nobody out there? But I find it hard to believe that there's any shortage of suitors for a Premier League football club.
There's a huge number of investors who are interested in investing in Premier League clubs. I think the underlying issue that Everton have is, if you just looked at the business by itself, and if you looked at the stadium by itself, there is a legitimate business case for investing in the club and for investing in the stadium as a long-term investment. And if it was just that in isolation, I don't think there would be an issue. we would find the type of investors that we're talking about, because other football clubs have done the same, and other football clubs with far less potential than Everton have. I think it's easy to get sort of sucked into the doom and gloom, and a lot of people accuse me of putting that doom and gloom out there. But we are a club with massive potential still, even despite the situation that we find ourselves in. We are a fan base that is probably unique in English football in terms of its willingness to support the club and its potential for revenue growth in the future in terms of the stadium, but also in terms of, if we're a more successful football club, Evertonians will spend more money with the football club. That's obviously a given. The issue why we're not attracting the right type of investors is because the investors are looking at, okay, how much money is needed for the stadium? That seems reasonably sensible. It might be expensive, but it's doable. How much money is needed to reinvest in the football club? Again, quite a lot of money, but not an unreasonable sum. Not some that should frighten anybody from doing it if they're the right type of investors and they've got the right experience. The problem is that on top of that, Farhad Moshiri is asking for an unreasonable figure for the equity. So he owns 94.1% of Everton Football Club. And if he values the football club at, say, for example, 500 million, he's expecting something like 470 million in return for his equity stake. And that's really the issue. Nobody is prepared to fund the stadium, fund the football club, pay off the debt, and also pay Farhad Moshiri, as close to $500 million as you're likely to get, because that total investment is something probably approaching anywhere from £1 to £1.2 billion, depending upon how much you think they're going to spend on the stadium, how much they're going to spend on the football club in the future. And frankly, that just doesn't represent value to professional investors. The Saudis spent less than 300 million in coming into Newcastle, and okay, they put money into the club and they're investing in the squad and stuff, but they will end up probably spending, well, certainly less than half the amount that somebody coming into Everton would have to spend if they paid Farhad Moshiri what he wants paying for his shares. And that is the big difficulty, that nobody is prepared to do that. So until such a time as Farhad Moshiri is willing to accept what the price is for the shares, what a reasonable price for the club is, we're going to have that problem. And the only people that will be attracted in are the people who probably are unsuitable investors, perhaps because they're getting the money from a questionable source, or perhaps because they're not doing the due diligence that they should be doing, or perhaps because they've got unrealistic expectations of their abilities. And I think this is the case with 777. They've got unrealistic expectations of their abilities to succeed with their investment. And that to me is the biggest problem. So until that problem is resolved with Farhad Moshiri, he's not going to find, like the fairy godmother that waves a wand and solves all of his problems and solves all of Everton's problems. Because frankly, those people just don't exist in business. And he probably knows that, but he's probably not prepared to admit it at this stage. The problem that we have is the longer that we go without the investment that's desperately needed, the greater the chance that the club gets into even greater difficulties than it is currently. And, I've talked about the threat of administration. I'm not expecting us to go into administration next week. But what I'm saying is that because we spend all the money we earn on the football team and on our operating costs, and then we've got probably about the same amount of money to spend on an annual basis on the stadium, we can't do both together with the resources that the club has got. And So what is the solution? If we don't get the investment in, we can't borrow more money. Farhad Moshiri can't put more money into the club himself. Let's be realistic here. What is the solution? And there is no solution other than administration. So something has to give. And what has to give is Farhad Moshiri has to accept a reasonable price for his equity in the club. And if that means that he has to realize that he's lost the vast majority of his investment in the football club, then as regrettable as that might be, that is the reality. Because if the club was to go into administration, he'd lose far more. In fact, he'd lose everything. So it's a question of what's the least worst option for Farhad Moshiri, and selling the club at a reasonable price so that the new owners can invest in the stadium, can invest back into the football club and get us competitive again, is the best solution for everybody. Even if perhaps the new owners left Farhad Moshiri with a minority holding within the club, as long as he doesn't have any influence over the running of the club, I think most people would still find that acceptable. That would allow him, if he found the right owners, to recover some of his losses, because hopefully with the right owners, the value of the football club would increase over the next few years.
So unfortunately, we seem very dependent on Moshiri being a realistic man going forwards, and he's not exactly demonstrated that in the last seven or 8 years. And it does seem like the only solution going forwards is he has to lower his expectations about how much he's going to get in return. And as you mentioned before, it's between 1 and 1.2 billion. It's an average. It's an estimate expectation for what a new investor would have to come into the club with. But as you said, there is a solution. It's Moshiri becoming more realistic, whether that's reducing his stake. As I said, we all want him gone. I don't think I'm sure pretty much everyone would be in agreement about that. But if it means that he has to take a back seat while he's still at the club, to give someone else the chance to not increase his stake, increase the value of his stake in the club, so he can eventually sell on, maybe that has to be that. But Paul, I am very conscious of running out of time, and it is Friday evening, so I don't want to keep you any longer. But thank you very much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Hopefully provided some balance. I mean, on the face of it, none of this is great news. But there are solutions. There are solutions to our problems if only Farhad Moshiri recognizes that he's going to have to take some of the pain.
Unfortunately, I don't foresee that coming anytime soon. I mean, I can't predict the future, but we'll have to see how that develops. Hopefully, the 777 investment goes no further, because they are absolutely, as you've spoken about at length, as everyone's almost spoken about now, they are unsuitable to come in and sort out the club's mess. And we need credible investors. We need suitable investors with experience that are actually going to turn this ship around, and hopefully a brighter future down the line. But thank you, Paul, once again. I mean, if anyone's been living under a rock, as always, I have to ask you, where can people find you if they want to find out more?
Well, the Esk on Twitter, and theesk.org on the internet, I suppose. That's where you can find me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening, not watching actually today, because we're not on camera. Be sure to check out everything else that's been going up on the channels recently. Check out all the social media. Hopefully, we'll get back from the international break with a win. I think that's maybe asking a bit much. It is Arsenal. I think our easier fixtures are maybe just behind us now, but there is still plenty to come this season. There are reasons to be positive, both this season and in the long term, hopefully. So as I mentioned, thank you all very much for listening, and join us next time on the Toffee Blues.